All right, we are back for another episode of TPS, the Productivity Show, the number one podcast on productivity, time management, and efficiency. And of course, I don't do this all alone. I have my co-host Brooks Duncan here. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm great. Really excited for today's very special episode, 80s after school style. This is a very special episode of the Productivity Show. And I've been looking forward to this one all day. In fact, just before recording, I got my haircut and somehow we got talking about the podcast, and the hairstylist had a bunch of questions for me about starting a podcast and running a podcast. And a lot of the things we're going to be talking about were things she was asking me. So yeah, I think this will be a very relevant episode.
Yeah, we have a major milestone to celebrate. And for those who are brand new to the show, my name is Tam Pham, founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency. And I do this show with my co-host Brooks Duncan here. And one of the things we always like to do is start off with our top three favorite resources to help you right away be more productive. So we have three of them here today. So Brooks, what are they?
All right. So our top three resources are generally podcast related because that's what we're going to be talking about today. Number one is a tool which we'll be touching on later in the episode, but I wanted to highlight it here. It's called Zencaster. So Zen started with a Z with no E at the end. And it's basically really easy web-based recording. So if you're ever recording with more than one person, you can do a lot of the tech stuff that we're going to be talking about in the episode today, but it makes it very, very easy, especially for your guests to record. It's all web-based. You can download the files, makes it very easy. That's number one. Number two is Descript, and that is web-based audio and podcast editing. So we don't use this for reasons which we're going to talk about later in the episode again. However, I know a lot of people who do and really, really love it. So Descript, if you're wanting to edit your podcast, but you don't want to be messing around with really complicated tools, it makes it very easy to edit. And number three is Crisp and Crisp.ai. And that is a tool that will block out background noise from your recording. And some of our members of the Asian Efficiency team live with lots of family members and pets at home. And when they get on to record something, they will turn on Crisp. And it does quite a remarkable job blocking out that background noise. So those are three resources that might help you with your podcasting.
Yeah, so we'll have links to all of them in the show notes. So you can go to theproductivityshow.com/362. You can find them there as well. Or if you're listening to us in an app, just swipe and you'll see it there as well. So for today's episode, since it's slightly different, I want to kind of mention how if you are thinking about starting a podcast, I think you're going to be learning a lot. So if you have an inkling feeling of ever wanting to start a podcast and kind of get your message and experience out there, I think you're going to be learning a lot of details that will help you kind of like jumpstart that process. And I know a small group of people who are listening already have a podcast. And if you want some tips for how to make it bigger, how to grow it, how to make it better, we're going to be sharing some tips and insights and numbers that I think you're going to be finding very interesting. But also, if you have no interest in starting a podcast yourself, but you are, a loyal listener to the Productivity Show, or you're just curious behind the scenes how we do stuff and what kind of our workflows look like and how we kind of get the stuff done out there and fast, there's going to be lots of tips for you to learn of what technology we use and workflows to kind of help you with that. So there's going to be a lot of material covered here today. And next week's episode is all about productive travel. So now that is picking up again. We want to share some of our favorite tips and hacks for you to be productive while you're on the road, but also before you get actually on the plane or getting to your destination. So be sure to check out next week's episode as well. So Brooks, we have a major milestone here at the Productivity Show. Since you're the co-host, I'm going to give you the honor to kind of share it with everyone.
Yeah, so we were very excited. I decided to check the stats, which we do regularly, regular, but we don't like obsess over the stats on the show. We're more about the content, which we're going to be talking about later, but we like to keep a watch on how things are doing. And I realized we had just crossed 10 million downloads, which was quite unbelievable to me. That was a very, very exciting milestone. We crossed it actually at the beginning of June. So we're probably, by the time this is released, probably about 10.1 million. And yeah, that was a very exciting milestone. And it's funny, we're going to get into our process for planning out the episodes a little later in the episode, but we had kind of off to the side of our content plan that if we ever hit 10 million downloads, we would do a behind the scenes episode of the productivity show. So that's how this came to be. We crossed 10 million downloads. So onto the content schedule it went. So we wanted to pause on the pure productivity tips that we do every week and go behind the scenes on the podcast. So we're going to talk about things like what we use to record, what we'd recommend that people use if they're just starting out and they don't want to spend a ton of money. You don't have to go crazy and buy a ton of gear to start a podcast. We're going to talk about our podcast workflow, how we come up with topic ideas, how we create the episode, how it gets edited and posted. We're going to talk about guests, how we choose them, how that all works. And we're even going to talk about something which not a lot of podcasts actually talk about, which is advertisers. So how the whole sponsor thing works, how we get sponsors, how we choose them, how to get started, and that sort of thing. So really excited to go behind the scenes on the podcast in this episode. But I have a question for you, Tam, because I wasn't around since, well, I sort of was, which we'll get to, but I wasn't around since the beginning of the productivity show. But you obviously were, because the productivity show came out of the work that you were doing at Asian Efficiency. So how did you get the idea of starting a podcast? Did you have like a goal for the number of listeners? Did you have a plan to reach 10 million? How did that all work at the beginning of the podcast?
Yeah. So to kind of put the numbers in perspective, like 10 million downloads sounds like a lot already, right? But just to give you some context, I don't know the exact statistics, and maybe we can even look it up while we're doing this, but I believe it's less than 1% of all podcasts ever reach 1 million downloads. So to be able to reach 10 million downloads is just like crazy when I think about that, right? And we started the podcast back in, I want to say 2015. So it's been about 6.5 years now, and it's been steadily growing every single year. And I was actually always resistant to starting a podcast. So back in 2015, when we launched it, leading up to it, it was about 6 months of kind of like decision making and kind of deciding if we actually wanted to do this. And back then we had Mike and Zach really leading the charge. We're now doing other things elsewhere. And they said, Tan, we have to start a podcast. Like, this is the next big thing. Like, everyone is going to start listening to podcasts, yada, yada, yada. Like, this is the trend we have to hop on, right? And when you have limited resources, like, well, this is also at a time when YouTube was like kind of like a big channel as well, right? Like, YouTube was taking off. Lots of people are, consuming content on video. Like, and if we look back to where we are today, like, everyone is on YouTube, right? And it's gone even bigger than what podcasting is right now. And at that time, we had to make a decision to say, hey, are we going to invest in video? Are we going to invest in audio? Or are we going to do something else? Like, we have only limited budget and resources. Like, what are we going to do? And so as we were deciding on this, one of the things that I didn't like about the podcast idea was that the tracking and analytics of podcasting was very limited, was very primitive. The only thing you could really see was the number of downloads, which doesn't really say much, right? And so that was kind of like the biggest reservation for me to kind of start the podcast, because I couldn't know if we're going to put the time and effort to make it worthwhile to actually do this, right? And so long story short, the reason we actually started the podcast was because Mike and Zach just kept bugging me and bugging me and bugging me till I basically gave in and said, okay, let's just do it. I actually don't want to be involved with it because I have so many other things I need to focus on. So treat it as a passion project. I'll let you guys run it. You guys can kick it off, right? And just roll with it. And so they just kind of roll with it, and they started it, and kind of took things from there. And as we started to see more success and growth in it, I was like, oh, this is actually a really good idea. Man, I wish we started this like a year earlier or 2 years earlier. So, you always have that feeling of like, is it too late? Like, can I still do it today? Oh, absolutely. If you're thinking about starting a podcast today, yes, there's always that feeling of like, I wish I'd done it earlier, right? But you can always start today, and still growing every single year. Advertising numbers are going up. People that are consuming podcasts are going up, right? So it's not too late to start a podcast.
The interesting thing about tracking and that sort of thing, and I'm sure there's people listening to this who struggle with this as well, and it is hard to make that link, because it's hard to, especially if you are in a company that sells things or whatever. It's hard to say, oh, person X listens to a podcast and then goes and buys Y. That would be the dream for a lot of people, but it's hard to do that. However, when we do surveys of our readers, our customers, and stuff like that, so many of them say they found us through the podcast, or they love the podcast, or that sort of thing. So it's hard to make that direct link, but the link is definitely there, even if it's very difficult to monitor, to have definitive statistics about it. So we said we were going to go behind the scenes, so we might as well get straight into it now. And like I said, the first thing we're going to talk about is podcasting recording gear and the tools that we use. And we want to start there because that's the thing that everybody has questions about. Whenever we do any sort of course, that's not even about podcasts, people ask us about this. So we wanted to have this episode where we talk about some of the gear we use and what we recommend and things that maybe you don't need. At a high level for recording a podcast, you basically need four things. You need a mic and somewhere to plug it in. You need a microphone, that is. You need some software or something to record that podcast. You need some way to edit that podcast, unless you don't edit your podcast, which some don't, but most do, I'm going to say. And you need somewhere to upload it. You need somewhere to put it where people can download it. So we're not going to go step by step through those four parts of podcasting gear and tools. And we'll start with the microphone, because again, this is something we get a lot of questions on. It's also an area where people get really, really confused, because there's so many different microphones out there. There's so many different microphone recommendations swirling around. To make matters worse, a lot of podcasters really fetishize their gear. So you'll have some people say, oh, if you're not going to buy this $500 to $600 microphone, don't even bother, right? Or you'll read one article and they'll say, oh, these are 5 great mics to use. And then you'll read another one and it says, whatever you do, don't use those 5 mics. It's very, very confusing. And I think it can be really off-putting for people as well. So we might as well just start, because I'm sure people are wondering the mics that we use. Tan, what microphone do you personally use?
So the microphone I use is called an Heil PR40. So it's spelled HEIL and then PR, so Peter and Robin, and then 40, so PR40. And I think I bought this like a long time ago, like 5-6 years ago when we started the podcast. So this has always been my primary mic and the first mic. And I think back in the day it was like $400, and I think now it's like 300 something. So it's a great mic. If you've been listening to the productivity show at some point and you hear my voice, like this is the mic I've been using all this time. And just like photography, I see this too. I have a lot of friends who teach photography and make a living teaching others how to shoot photos and stuff. And they say the same thing. It's not really about the camera. It's really about the person behind the camera that is using it, right? And it's the same thing with podcasts. Like most people get obsessed about which mic should I use. And what you really should be obsessing about is, can you consistently put content out there, or good ideas, or have a message that resonates with people? That is more important than the mic you will use. Now, if you're entering a crowded podcast space, if you may call it, I think having a good mic will definitely help you set apart, right? Because it's a show of quality, right? And then you can kind of differentiate yourself in that sense. But also, I know from personal experience, listening to someone with bad audio quality when that is the main channel is kind of annoying and very troubling, right? So the good thing is you don't have to have an expensive mic to sound good, right? We just happen to have like this quote unquote expensive mic. It's about $300, but we also have a mic that we use every now and then. It's called an ATR, something that I think we have linked in here, an ATR 2100. That I use as well, and I've used for other podcast episodes because it's very small and mobile, and I've used a bunch of recordings with that mic as well with some guests. and it works just as fine. I know it's your backup microphone as well, Brooks, and I have one here at home as a backup as well. So again, and that's maybe like $50 or something. So again, you don't have to have an expensive mic. What's really most important is you consistently putting content out there.
Yeah, if you are starting out wanting to start a podcast and you weren't sure what microphone to use, yeah, the Audio Technica ATR 2100 is a great mic. I almost said starter mic, but really it could be your permanent mic and it would be totally fine. I use it as my backup mic. I use it if I'm traveling somewhere, if I'm going offsite. I've talked about on the podcast before how we did this big reno and I was out of the house for a month and a half, and I exclusively recorded the podcast and made courses with that microphone because I was at a co-working space. So yeah, that is where I would start, because the thing about fancier microphones like the Heil PR40, which is also what I use, and the only reason I use it really is because that's what you guys used. So I just bought the same one. But the tricky thing about these fancier mics is you can't actually plug them into your computer. They use a connector called XLR, and the problem with that is none of our computers have XLR ports, of course. So you also need what's called a USB interface. And the one that Tan, I know you use, is called the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2. So we have links to that in the show notes as well, which basically just lets you plug microphones into that, which you then plug into your computer. But the nice thing about the Audio Technica is it supports both XLR, but also USB. So you don't even need to worry about all this stuff if you're just starting out. You can plug it straight into your laptop, which is what I do when I use it, and just get going. You can upgrade to that kind of like fancier stuff later if you choose to, and it supports it as well. But yeah, you don't need it. So like you said, I think having good audio is important. I'm definitely not going to say it's not important, but I think you don't want to have bad audio, but I think having an amazing microphone with amazing tools at the start, I don't think is that required. The most important thing, like you said, is the content and the person. I've listened to the podcast episodes where maybe the guest had horrible audio, like they had maybe a lapel mic that was brushing on their jacket or something like that, but the content was so good, I didn't mind. I kept listening. So if you're going to prioritize anything, I would do content first and audio second. All right, so that is the microphone. Both Tan and I use the Heil PR40, but if you were just starting out, check out the Audio Technica ATR 2100. It's way less expensive and very flexible. The next thing you'll need, of course, is some way to record it. You need to get your voice from the microphone into your device, which then you can edit and upload. So this is another area where you don't have to spend a bunch of money. There's a tool called Audacity, which we'll link to in the show notes. It's free for both Mac and Windows. That is a very common way to record podcasts. On the Mac, there's a program that comes with your Mac called GarageBand that is also free, and that people I know use that to record podcasts. We use a tool, both Tan and I are Mac users, so we use a software called Audio Hijack Pro, which is very easy to use, and it works well for the way that we record, which is called a double ender, which I'll get into a little bit. But you don't, again, need to spend a bunch of money. You can just go with whatever you have. And if you're just getting started, we always like to say the getting started part. Just use a tool like Zencaster or try something else like that. You don't need to do a bunch of tech stuff. You can just do the web stuff. Once you've recorded it, you of course need to edit it, and you can use all of those same apps that I just talked about for recording. You can use those to edit. So you don't need to spend an expensive program like Logic on the Mac or something like that. You don't need to spend a bunch of money. You can just use those free tools that we talked about earlier. Now, I have a question for you, Tan. And this is more about process, which is like, for me personally, I weirdly like editing video and audio. I find it like kind of meditative. How do you manage that decision? But we don't edit, actually. We have an editor to do it. So how did you make that decision to have an editor do it, even though we have all the skills to do it internally?
Yeah, I believe the first, I want to say 60 to 100 episodes. I don't know the exact number, but within that range, we definitely did all the editing in house. So we did it ourselves, right? And we had, as you have seen, like very extensive documentation and screenshots of how to edit a podcast, which settings to use, and so on. And I think it's always useful before you delegate something to do it yourself, because then you know how the process works. You kind of know if someone is doing a good job. So anytime you're delegating something, having done it yourself is always a good idea. And so we did it in the beginning ourselves, and it takes a lot of time, especially when you have multiple people involved, whether it's like one or two, three people, but also it requires a lot of quote unquote deep work in a way, because you have to pay very close attention, especially if you have someone who has like a very strong desire for perfection. You can, spend countless of hours editing like 60 minutes of audio, which could take you like 2 to 3 hours, right? The benchmark is usually 1 hour of audio. It takes about double amount of time of editing. So usually an hour of content takes about 2 hours of editing. That's kind of like a rough benchmark that you can keep in mind. So I knew that if we continue to do this internally, it would take up a lot of time and resources that we could redirect to other people as well. And so we were approached by several different people to edit our podcasts, and it came out to be very competitive in terms of the rates. And if I thought about and calculated, okay, this is the rate that they're charging us, plus all the things that they're willing to do for us, compared to what people are getting paid to do this stuff, then it makes a lot of sense to actually have them do it. Because one, this is the number one thing that they do. So this is like their specialty, right? Audio editing is not our main specialty. So I don't want most of our people working on that if it's not the main specialty that they have, right? So I'd rather specialize there. And we really started to do it because it would save us a lot of time that we could use for other things. So creating better content, doing more research. If I had to start all over again, what I would recommend now is, once you start making some sort of revenue from your podcast, that would be a great time to start outsourcing the editing. So do it yourself in the beginning and figure out a way to make revenue as soon as possible. I wouldn't wait forever, but figure out a way to make revenue. And as soon as you get that revenue, reinvest it by having someone else edit it for you. And because you then create more time for yourself, you can create better podcasts, source better guests, yada, 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 and focus on growing your podcast rather than just editing or production. So that's something I would consider.
All right, so we're going to get into our podcasting workflow now. A few things that came up during the live stream, because we record these live streams with our Dojo members, which is our productivity community, and TPS Plus, which is our premium version of the productivity show, which has no ads and you can attend live streams. You can find out more about that at theproductivityshow.com/plus. But a few questions. Joel asked, and I should have mentioned this, I meant to, for the microphones, the microphone is important, like we said, but the most important part is having what's called a pop filter in the front. So that is when you ever see somebody recording with like a fuzzy thing on the front or like a metal filter, that's called a pop filter. And you'll definitely, no matter which mic you use, you'll definitely want one of those. And then Giacomo mentions that Ferrite is a very popular app on the iPad. So you can actually record and edit a podcast on your iPad, believe it or not. That's not personally for me, but people do use it. And Ferrite is a good app for that. All right, so let's get into how we make the podcast, our podcast workflow, now that we've got through the gears. Let's start with ideas. So, of course, you have to have an idea for what to talk about. That's really important. A lot of people, or some podcasts, will just hit record and go. We always like to have a central idea for every episode. This podcast, or this process, has changed a lot over the years. It used to be just one person coming up with everything. Then we would try having like the entire team. So you'd have 6 people coming up with ideas. That didn't work quite so well. And then we used to kind of come up with topics every 2 weeks or so with our sprints. That was fine, but our most successful workflow is Tan, you and I sit down and brainstorm topics for a quarter at a time. So we'll just do 3 months worth of episodes right off the bat, put it in a Google Sheet. And that has worked out really well, I think. And the way we do that is we look at popular topics, questions from our customers and listeners and our community. Sometimes we have themes, like recently we've done 3 episode themes on the T framework or getting things done. It's not set in stone. We change things on the fly quite a bit, but it's so helpful to have that plan to go ahead, because I can say this for any creative thing that you do, whether it's a podcast, writing a blog, email newsletter, or whatever. Such a big way to fall off the wagon of doing those and not be consistent is to have to sit there and think up what you're going to create on. So if you have a big list up front, it makes it so easy to just get started and go in and do it versus having that friction of having to come up with an idea every week or every 2 weeks. So if you really want to be consistent with your podcasting, highly recommend thinking up topics ahead of time so you don't have to scramble every week. Now, Tan, question for you. We've kind of like made one rule when we made these podcast episodes. This episode is that way, but a little different. But with our general episodes, we kind of have a rule that we always have front and center in our show notes whenever we create them. So maybe you can talk about our rule for when we're creating podcast episodes.
If you've been listening to us for a while or been following us for a while, you know what makes us different from many other productivity podcasts or people who create productivity content that is out there is that our stuff is always very actionable. It's not very philosophical many times. It's very actionable. So, by the end of the podcast episode or by the end of the blog post, you'll know 1 or 2 things that you should do next to start taking action, right? And so you'll notice every single episode always ends with action steps or things you should be doing so that you know how to summarize 1, the content in your head, but also 2, how to take the next step. Because most of us have a lot of ideas, know what to do, but sometimes are paralyzed taking the first step. So we wanted to make sure that first step is as simple as possible and that there should be no confusion around what you should be doing as the first thing. So our number 1 rule for every single episode is that it has to be actionable, right? So we can talk about like different productivity frameworks and so on as an idea or concept and compare them, but what's the action step that we want people to take at the end, right? And that's the most important thing for anything that we produce, whether it's an online course, online training, a blog post, a podcast episode. Everything always has to be actionable. So I love talking about theories and philosophies, and I do that a lot in my personal life with different people. But at the end of the day, when you're listening to us, yes, you want valuable information, ideas, and contents, but also you want to take action and get the results that we just talked about, right? So how can we make it as easy as possible for you to take that first step? And that's why we always end it with something actionable.
All right, so that's how we come up with the ideas. Then, of course, we have to create the episode and record it. So the way that works is usually one of us will put together the show notes, and then the other one will review it and add their thoughts and examples and stuff like that to it. Giacomo in the live stream right now, which, by the way, we record on Zoom. If anyone's wondering how we do that, we keep it very simple. We just record it on Zoom. Giacomo asks, how do we know what to talk about when we're recording the episode? Do we, especially since when we record it, it's on camera when we're recording. Do we have like teleprompter? No, we don't have anything fancy like that. We just have a Google Doc that we both have, and we just go off of that. And if you're a TPS Plus member, like I mentioned earlier, you can actually get a PDF copy of our show notes every single week. So you can see the actual show notes we use to record and the things that made it into the episode, the things that were cut, and that sort of thing. So sometimes things get cut and moved around, but TPS members can see it all. So like I mentioned, we record live in front of the TPS Plus and Dojo members. We do it every single Wednesday, pretty much. We used to record on Mondays, but we found that holidays are often messed up our recording schedules, and then more Dojo and TPS Plus members can make it on Wednesdays versus Mondays. And that's another tip for you if you are trying to get into a regular recording rhythm. And this is a productivity tip we give all the time, which is set yourself up for success. We were having problems doing it on Mondays. It was just always like, it just wasn't, we were having trouble. But once we moved it to Wednesdays, it was smooth sailing. So choose a date and a time that chances are isn't going to conflict with other things. And as far as I know, we've recorded an episode every single week since 2015. I don't think we've ever, or released an episode, I should say. I don't think we've ever missed one. And that I wanted to bring that up because consistency is so key for podcasts. If an episode expects an episode if a listener expects an episode every productive Monday, you need to make sure that there is one there every single Monday, because podcasting is so routine based. A lot of podcasts learn this lesson with the pandemic. I've met listeners in person who told me that they always listen while they're, say, in their pickup line at school to pick up their kids or on their commute. I have podcasts I listen to always at the gym. Podcasting is very, very routine based. So if you want your audience to stick with you, you need to keep your commitment to them as well. That's not to say that if you miss a week that you should just fold up shop. Like we have our rule, don't miss twice, but try as much as you can to be consistent. Any more thoughts on that, Tan, the creation process and the consistency?
Yeah, we've never missed a release date over the last 6.5 years. So that's like 362 episodes that we haven't missed, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. And that is not by accident, right? Like that is because we have a process in place, a system in place, a routine in place. Like that is the thing that allowed us to get to this place where we release a new episode every single week, right? Now, behind the scenes, there's sometimes a little bit of chaos because sometimes we can't record on Wednesday or one of us gets sick or whatever, like stuff like that happens. And so the thing to always keep in mind, and this is a lesson you can apply in anything in life, is to have some sort of margin or buffer in your life, right? So we always have a backlog of a few episodes, like 2, 3, maybe at most, of episodes that we've recorded previously and that we could always kind of slot in somewhere if needed be, right? So if someone gets sick or something happens, like we know we can anticipate that happen at some point. So if that were the case, okay, let's slot something else in so that we can still have a rhythm for all of you to be able to download and listen to us every single productive Monday, right? So for anything that you do, think about what's the margin or buffer you can introduce. So if something does break down, which inevitably it will, what can you do in that situation? And the best time to take action in that situation and figure that stuff out is way before it actually happens, right? When stuff breaks down, like that's the worst moment to be in, to start planning and figuring out like how to address this for it in the future. Like, you want to be very proactive about that, right? And so there's no accident to the fact that we release something every single week. And I hope that inspires many of you who are listening here, and that one, it's not difficult to do something consistently. We've done this every single week, and I've shown up many times not wanting to record or just not feeling the greatest. And I'm sure you felt that way too as well, Brooks. And we still showed up and did it for you, right? And there's something about showing up every single week at the same time that allowed us to kind of get to where we are today with this major milestone, even when and you didn't feel like recording or showing up, right? It's just like going to the gym. It's more important to show up consistently, even if you don't feel like it. But every time we finish an episode or every time we finish that workout where we're like, oh man, I didn't feel like coming in, but I'm so glad I did it, right? It's the same thing.
Phil in the live stream asks, do you record each week or do you release each week, even over Christmas, New Year? Yeah, 100%. Christmas, New Year, Lunar New Year. We never miss a week releasing. But like Tan said, we don't necessarily record each week. And that's where we move into this next section, which is talking about guests. So the Productivity Show, we do have guests on the podcast. We used to have a lot of guests on the Productivity Show, but in fact, before joining the AE team, I had the honor of being the second guest ever way back in TPS006. So way back in the early days, I was a guest. But a few years ago, we made the decision to scale that back a little bit. We decided not to be a guest interview show, not because we don't like guests, and we have guests on, like I said, and we really, really like having guests, but the reason we did that is because we want every episode to be about a specific actionable topic, going back to what Tan said earlier about how every episode needs to be actionable. So we decided we wanted each actionable episode to be about a specific topic versus a general interview, like maybe talking about someone's book or something like that. Again, nothing wrong with those episodes, but we just decided that's a change we wanted to make in the podcast. So when we do have a guest on, It doesn't necessarily have to be someone famous, but it does have to be someone that has helpful and actionable advice on a specific topic for our audience. That's the way we try to go in that way. Now, one thing I will say about guests is an area, and I'm curious of your thoughts on this, Tan, an area where I think we've improved, but we still have farther to go is we have had the feedback that we could use more female voices on the podcast. It would have been nice if we could have had Marmel on this episode as well, but that timing didn't work out. And it's definitely true. If you look back at the early days, most of the people talking on the podcast were guys. Starting back in about 2019, we have been intentionally trying to have more female guests. Marmel is on more, and we actively try to search out more female guests to have on the podcast. We've definitely done better, but I went back and checked, and we've done about 40% of our guests have been female. So there's really no reason why it can't be 50-50. Our audience, I'm pretty sure, is 50-50. Certainly our customer base and our reader base is. So we're actively going to even try that even more to at least get 50-50, especially since the Asian efficiency team is 50-50 male and female. So we want to have that balance. Do you have any thoughts on that change over time, Tan?
Yeah, we definitely listen to feedback, and anytime you email us or write, a review, we take all that feedback into consideration. And we have a weekly meeting every Wednesday where we look at all the feedback that was collected recently, and we kind of discuss things internally. So if you ever wrote to us with something like with criticism or positive feedback or negative feedback, it definitely made its way at some point into one of our meetings, whether we publicly stated that or not to you, but we look at that all the time. And one of the things we've definitely noticed a few years ago was, hey, we would love to see more female guests. And so we definitely made a conscious effort to do so. And so there was a streak even for a while where we had like 4 female guests back to back to back. And, there's no reason it couldn't be 50-50. We totally can, right? And if you're listening to us and you're like, hey, I'm female, I have a message, I have something to say, I would love to share on the podcast, please reach out to us. Make it really easy for us to get there. So if you are that person, just email us at podcast@asianefficiency.com, and we'll make sure to kind of schedule something and figure something out. And yeah, we're also very, I wouldn't say picky, but very selective about our guests, because we want to make sure, one, it's actionable content, but also two, I'm sure you've seen it on other podcasts, like when someone publishes a book, they go like on this podcast round and they're like on every single podcast, right? And sometimes we do have those people because they have a very valuable message, but really we want people to come on because they have an important message and there's no like marketing or sales or ulterior motive behind it. It's just because they want to be really helpful, right? And those are our favorite guests. And oftentimes those are guests that I personally know as well or have a personal relationship with. And those are oftentimes the best episodes that come out. So if you kind of go back, there's a lot of them where you'll notice that these are all people that I know personally, or Brooks knows personally and has met them in person as well, right? And so I also want to open up the floor and say, hey, if you have a specific guest in mind, or you heard someone on someone else's podcast and you go, oh my gosh, like this person should be on the productivity show, email us, podcast@asianefficiency.com. If you can somehow reference an episode or say like this person's name or something like that, or have an introduction that you can make, we would love that.
All right, so let's wrap up with the final section. And again, this is an area which is not talked about a lot on podcasts, I don't think, but is definitely an area where people have a lot of questions about. I always see this in podcasting groups. So many questions about this, which is sponsors. We love our sponsors. They make the show possible. And whenever possible, we have advertisers on that we love and have personal experience with, just like Tan said. As an example, in the last episode, and spoiler alert, the next episode, one of our sponsors is SaneBox, which is a tool I love and have used since 2016. So we always try to have those type of sponsors whenever possible. Question for you, Tan. We already had sponsors before I joined the podcast. How did you go about arranging to have sponsors? How did you decide when to have sponsors? If someone was like launching a podcast today, people are always wondering like, how long should I go before having sponsors? do you recommend that they try to get them right away, build an audience first? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it took us about 2, 3 years before we introduced the first sponsor, and that was a long time. So if I had to change it back, I would say introduce a sponsor as soon as you have viable numbers to show an advertiser that your podcast, one, is growing, but also two, that you have a message and an audience that resonates with a certain company, right? So we had pretty substantial numbers before we started getting sponsors. However, our decision initially was to just kind of like talk about our own stuff, right? So we have our own products and courses and so on. And so we didn't need the sponsorships necessarily to kind of like help us grow the company, right? And what changed for us was as we started to spend more time on the podcast, it became essentially more expensive to run the podcast as well. There was more time into the research process. The labor costs went up, right? All these expenses were going up and we're spending more time on it. And so one thing I noticed is it was actually very expensive to produce an episode, right? So I did a really extensive cost analysis, and just to put it in perspective, the average episode, if you take in all the time of research, editing, uploading, right, reviewing stuff, costs over $1,000 for us to produce one episode, and that includes labor time and so on, right? And if you have 4 episodes a month, that's like quote unquote $4,000 of expenses and time as well that we could redirect to other things as well, right? And also, in order for the podcast to be sustainable, it has to have its own kind of like economic engine. If it doesn't have its own economic engine, it's really hard to make it sustainable, because then it has to borrow quote unquote funds or resources from other areas to be sustainable. And that would just not be a long-term solution for that, right? So my thought process was, if the podcast in itself can generate direct revenue, then we can sustain it as its own little engine, right? And that's how we can have like continue to be able to pay our editor, continue to pay people who are involved with the podcast and so on, because it does take a lot of time and effort and expertise to kind of build this stuff, right? And so once we did introduce the podcast, then, number one criteria was to make sure, one, that we are, fully supportive of the sponsor, right? So I wouldn't want to advertise something that I personally haven't used, or that I think is a little scammy, or I think is like, looks a little weird by association, right? I don't want to have any like adult entertainment companies sponsoring a podcast or something like that. Like that would just be weird. Just like even a sports company, like, would be a little bit off as well, right? So we always want to make sure that there's some sort of alignment in terms of what we do and what we offer, and the sponsor as well. So we have a lot of people approaching us all the time, but we would have to say no 97% of the time or whatever. And I have to give kudos to Brooks, because Brooks does actually all the filtering and reviewing of that. And I usually just give the final yes. And sometimes we get free stuff as well, but we only get to that stage if we really like the sponsor. And oftentimes we also make suggestions. So we actually work with an agency who does that for us. So it's called Authentic. And so that's the podcast agency that we work with. And so what they do is they source all the sponsors for us. And anytime we get a deal that's being done, they take a percentage of the deal, right? And so they do all the hard work finding people for us and companies to work with us. And they kind of know who's listening, like what kind of stuff you guys like, and making sure that we find a sponsor that aligns with that, right? And so that makes our job really easy, because now we can just continue to focus on creating great content, right? While they do a good job of like finding and sourcing companies that kind of match our message.
Yeah, I think your point about labor costs and the true costs of making an episode is a really important one. Not so much if you're making a podcast as a hobby, like I don't know, you want to do podcasts about electric bikes or Star Trek or something like that. If it's just like a hobby podcast, that's a different thing. Although you do need to think about what you could be doing otherwise with that time. But if you're doing a podcast in your business or to support your business or something like that, then it becomes really, really important to understand the time, energy, and attention, like we always say, that goes into that. Because if you've got people coming up with ideas, like it's pretty expensive for Tan and I to sit there and bang out a quarter's worth of topics, or for me to sit there and make show notes every week or whatever. So you got to think about that stuff. It's not just the amount you're paying an editor or something like that. You got to think of the whole big picture. We know that, having said all this, we do love our advertisers, obviously, but we know that not everybody wants to listen to a podcast with ads. So that's actually why we created the TPS Plus, which is a way that you could sponsor the podcast directly. So some people choose to go that way. And like I mentioned, theproductivityshow.com/plus, you get episodes a week early and you get them totally ad free. But if you are happy to have ads, then that's totally great as well, because we hear all the time from people who love our sponsors, whether it's current sponsors like SaneBox or past ones like Grammarly or something like that. We hear all the time people really, really like our sponsors. So we're glad that we get to highlight awesome companies. And similar to guests, if you know a company that would be a great fit, maybe you've heard them sponsor another podcast or something, feel free to hit us up on social media or email, again, podcast@asianefficiency.com, and we will try to make the connection. All right, Tan, this was how we make the productivity show. It's pretty much everything that goes into it. I hope people listening have found it helpful. But like you said, our number one rule for every single episode is to make it actionable. So if somebody wants to get started either making a podcast or maybe making their podcast a little bit better, what's your recommendation?
Yeah. So if you're thinking of starting a podcast, buy a really cheap microphone, right? So the ATR 2100 is a great one, $50 or so, and just start recording one episode. Don't even worry about publishing it. Just record it and just see what that is like, right? Because I think the biggest fear that people have is that they have no one that will listen to them, or that they have no one to kind of like publish to. But that's not the thing that you should be worrying about. If you want to start a podcast, number one thing you should be focusing on is just starting, getting that first episode done, and then just go from there. The rest you will figure out, and it's relatively easy. Okay. So just start recording and then go from there. So if you liked today's show, please rate and review us in the podcast app. You can use it in iTunes or whichever app you're in. And again, next week's episode is all about productive travel. So now that is picking up again, I'm really excited to share some of the latest travel hacks and tips with you here. And everything that we talked about today can be found in the show notes. So just go to theproductivityshow.com/362. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next Productive Monday.